At this time, I'm so happy that we're able to welcome Virginia Ludy to our FEO conference. Virginia is a passionate and highly motivated event leader with over 35 years of experience in the fair. As a former CEO of the Canadian National Exhibition, president of the Canadian Association of Fair and Exhibitions, and an industry advocate, Virginia has several major initiatives that help transform the CNE into an iconic, financially stable, must-see event. She currently serves on our industry as an advocate and a consultant assisting fairs and events transform themselves as they re-emerge from the pandemic stronger and more relevant than ever in the 21st century. Welcome, Virginia.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad that you're able to join us today because your talk really sort of bounces nicely off of the session we had with the minister and with Destination Ontario and our friends at TIO, and the rebirth of the events, the phoenix from the ashes of the pandemic. And I'm just looking so forward to hearing what you have to say about this. Virginia, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Dave, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to spend with me this morning. So I just thought we would speak a little bit about, we've heard a lot of really useful information this morning from Jess and Chris and Melanie and of course Minister MacLeod about how we truly are emerging from the ashes of this pandemic. And it is so encouraging and it's such positive news that we've heard, but there's still a lot of work that we need to do as we move into this rebirth, as I call it, and start to bring our festivals and our events back online. Next slide, please. So I thought that in this session, really what we'd look at is really the current environment, what changes there are in the marketplace, and where the opportunities lie for festivals and events post-pandemic. Next slide, please. So time marches on. We've all been at this pandemic business for over 2 years. I think that we're all pretty exhausted, but it's time for us to strap ourselves back in and get ready to relaunch our events. Next slide, please. So I thought we'd do a scan first to just the current environment. I know that we've heard a number of things from that have been touched on by previous speakers. So I'll try to focus on how perhaps some of these areas apply specifically to you at your event. So we know that there's been a tremendous change in consumer behavior. So we want to examine that and look at that a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the economic landscape, which seems to be very flexible and changing rapidly right now. And then, of course, what does the event and festival environment look like as it reemerges? Next slide, please. So consumer behavior. This guy here in the picture kind of reflects how I felt sometimes as a consumer as we move through this pandemic. We certainly have all had to change and be very nimble and flexible as we as consumers have adapted to the pandemic and all of the challenges that it put before us. Next slide, please. So some of the characteristics that we're seeing with consumers right now, and I was talking with a leader in our industry who does a lot of research on how consumers behave and changes in consumers' behavior. And in conversations with them, they talked about how angry and testy and fed up people are. We've all just had enough of this pandemic. We're bored. We are really just ready to move on, and but we also know that there have been a lot of implications that have come out of the pandemic that have affected consumers. There's a lot of mental illness now that's been talked about. A lot of people are lonely. We're seeing increases in crime, substance abuse, physical abuse. People are really Still, although things are changing, and we've seen a lot of rapid change in the last couple of weeks, I think, a lot of really, really positive change, people are still reluctant. They're still afraid. And so I think that as people start to reemerge into starting to do normal day-to-day activities, different people will do it at different, on different scales. And so there will be some people who will still be very, very hesitant, and others who may be willing to jump right in. I mean, we have the example of the other day when we saw the Raptors game, and there you had 18,000, 20,000 people in an arena together for the first time in a number of months, really enjoying that sporting event. And so those people clearly felt comfortable going into that setting. But there may be others who are perhaps a little bit more reluctant. And so there's a lot of still uncertainty around that is impacting people's ability to kind of just let their guard down and get out and enjoy themselves. There's also been a lot of divisiveness created by the pandemic. You know, there are different camps of people who have different beliefs or different thoughts about how we should have dealt with the pandemic and what precautions we should be taking or not taking. And it's really driven some really deep wedges into relationships. And so I think that this is something that as event organizers, you're going to have to consider when planning your events, because clearly we're hearing now some examples, just as restaurants have started reopening, that in some cases there have been instances where patrons, depending on what their beliefs or their thoughts are, have really challenged some restaurant owners around precautions that perhaps restaurants may still have in place if they've chosen not to move away from some of the previous means of vetting customers, so on and so forth in their policies. So it's just something that we need to be aware of, and hopefully as we progress through this recovery, we'll start to see less and less of this. And then people are kind of behaving in unexpected and concerning ways. I was talking to one event organizer, and he said, oh my word, he said, it's just, people are just not happy. And if they're not happy with something in the way in which you've delivered some level of service at your event, they seem to be a lot more open to letting you know that. And so, another thing that you should just keep in mind as you're planning your events, that people have been through a lot, and sometimes the stress and the impact of that is coming out in the way in which they're behaving. Next slide, please. So we're also seeing a lot of change in how consumers have consume goods, particularly how their purchasing habits have changed. You know, we've seen through the pandemic the absolute explosion of online shopping. You know, the shift almost to a cashless economy, driven by online shopping. Everything's paid by tap, credit card, debit cards. We're seeing a lot of change there. I know personally myself, I don't think I've carried cash in my purse in probably over 2 years now. I do everything by debit or credit card, just because in my mind, well, originally it was because it was safer, but now it's just a lot more convenient. And we've seen a lot of changes in how folks travel. We heard about that earlier in previous presentations, how staycations are now increased significantly, especially since, you know, cross-border travel was restricted up until just a short time ago, although we're starting to see more and more people venture out and beyond our borders, but certainly there is a significant increase in staycations. And of course, with the tax credit that the provincial government is offering, that makes it certainly a lot more attractive for people to stay within Ontario. And then we saw a real dependence on by consumers on depending on social media and the internet to stay informed. And this, you know, though a lot of the information was good information, there was also instances where a lot of misinformation got out about various events or things happening in the world that really clouded people's perspective or point of view. So just some things to keep in mind as we're thinking about reopening our event and how it's impacted consumers. Let's go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Shifts in the economic landscape. So we're seeing some pretty high inflation right now, not only a result of the pandemic, but of course, as a result of what's happening in Europe, skyrocketing housing costs, increases in homelessness, food and fuel costs, of course, have gone up significantly. Yesterday, we saw the first bump in interest rates that we've seen since 2018, and so that will start to have some impacts across the economy. The end of income subsidy programs and grants for businesses. We just heard some conversations about that. How some of those programs will be winding down. Increases in government and personal debt, and really a division of society into two distinct economic classes of the haves and the have-nots. There are folks who went through the pandemic and it really had little or no effect on them from a financial perspective. In fact, some people, really prospered in the pandemic and did well, while others really suffered. They lost their jobs. They had difficulty paying their rent or their mortgages, and so those are going to have some long-term impacts on society. And really, we're seeing a split into really two classes and some real pressure or loss of the middle class. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. We also know there's supply chain issues. We heard some of that discussion today, but we know that I was talking to one event producer who was telling me that one product that he normally orders a month or two prior to his event, he was having to order 8 to 9 months out in order to ensure delivery. There's been failures of a number of businesses have been servicing our events, or a lot of those businesses have been now servicing, providing service to COVID efforts, and so they're just not available to provide the level of service to us that they once did. We're seeing, reduction in number of vendors, partners. There may be people who are just no longer in business who you once used. There may be food vendors. There may be amusement ride companies, tent suppliers, portable washroom folks, any of those folks. So it's really, it's going to put an additional stress, I think, on the industry as events start to consider opening up and they start to realize that perhaps the number of suppliers and vendors isn't at the level that they once were. Because let's remember, this is the group that really has received absolutely no support from any of the government programs that were offered. Next slide, please. Changes in the labor market. Even before the pandemic hit, we were seeing some significant changes in the labor market. At one time, I can remember at the CNE, we used to have young people line up by the hundreds and hundreds, waiting to apply for the jobs that we had. And then things started to shift, and it started becoming more and more difficult for us to find employees. There just was not enough labor supply out there to fill those positions. So now we throw the pandemic on top of that. And it's, we've seen a lot of individuals migrate away from our industry because a lot of our events were shut down, and employees were either laid off, or a lot of them just chose to leave the industry and went elsewhere. So we've seen some major changes despite the short supply of employees. We're seeing, of course, we'll feel the impact of the increase of the minimum wage. And I was talking to one event producer who said to me, if you think the minimum wage is $15, you're kidding yourself. He said it's more like $20 plus, just because that's what they're having to offer in order to attract employees to come and work for them, in addition to benefits and other types of perks to attract them. So we're seeing labor shortages. The impact of working at home. You've had employees. If your employees are still with you, there may have been breaks in their employment. There may have, when they were laid off, there may be they may have been working from home. All of those things are going to have impacts on when you bring them back into the workforce and how you bring them back. So not only do you have to think about the consumers that you're trying to attract to your event, but you're going to have to think about your employees and how you work with them to help integrate them back into an active on-site workplace. And we're just starting to see, governments start to move towards bringing their employees back into the workforce. I know the Ontario government announced this week that they're going to start requiring their employees to work in their offices for 3 days a week starting in April. So we'll start to see, movement and shifts towards that. But there will be some things to consider when bringing employees back, so that you have a successful reintegration into the workplace. If you're an event that relies on volunteers, of course, there's been a huge impact with the suspension of student volunteer requirements during the pandemic. I would think that will probably open up again, and students will be looking for those opportunities again, but it may take time. And then if you're an event perhaps that has other volunteers, whether or not those folks are willing to come back and continue to volunteer, or whether they're don't feel comfortable re-engaging in that way. Productivity. We've had a lot of employees working from home, and there's a lot of different schools of thought around productivity of folks in the workplace versus working from home. And so you're going to have to think about that too, is what level of productivity can you expect from your employees when they come back into the workforce? We've also seen migration of workers out of urban centers. I saw a statistic a few weeks ago where 18,000 people have left Ontario and moved to the province of Nova Scotia. That's a significant number of people. That doesn't even count the people who've moved out of the Toronto area into rural or smaller urban centers within Ontario. So there is a real shift in migration of workers. Now, I don't think that it's all doom and gloom, because I think that as we start to reopen, the flow of new immigrants will start to re-emerge, which will be a very positive thing in centers, particularly like Toronto or London or Windsor, those big centers that attract new folks into their communities. But there may be a bit of a lull there between that picking up again. Changing work week hours. A lot of companies are now looking at should they be considering a 4-day week instead of a 5-day week. Of course, in the event industry, we're a little bit different, because our work period really focuses around when our events are on, but all stuff to just be aware of as you're looking to recruit employees for your event. Employee expectations around work environment, culture, and remuneration. this has changed. We're seeing where restaurants and hotels and all sorts of places are really having to get creative at how they provide remuneration to their employees to attract, and how they attract new employees, be it through um, signing bonuses or benefits, or really the culture that the employer is going to provide, or the environment. And employees' ability and willingness to change their career track for a better quality of life. So we've lost a lot of good people out of our industry. You know, when they got laid off, or they saw, you know, the way things were starting to unfold with the pandemic, they just decided to change track and shift to another career path. And so we've lost some really good quality employees out of the workforce. So it's going to take some time to bring new folks online, and to get some of them to the level that we had with previous employees. And we talked earlier a little bit about employee productivity. So let's move to the next slide, please. Changes in the event landscape, and we heard the minister talk a little bit about this morning. You know, boy, some events really changed on the fly and did a remarkable job. Kudos to them for being so creative and coming up with new ways of presenting their events. In talking with one event producer, he said to me, well, you know, we always had two models for our event when we were launching it, because we never were quite sure whether or not the current conditions would allow us to operate one way, or we'd have to swing another way. So he said we always had these hybrid events. Drive-through events. Who would have ever thought that we would be going through drive-through events, and drive-through movies and things like that would make a comeback? But, you know, event producers got really creative and really successful. I was talking to one event producer was telling me about an event they had held down in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. It was a drive-through event, and they could not believe how successful the event was, because people were just so wanting to get out of the house with their kids to do something. And they felt that by going to a drive-through event in their car, they felt very safe and comfortable. And so they had great success with it. Online events, a lot of events flipped to online events. I think there were some that were very successful, and there were some that weren't very successful. But you know, it was a very quickly emerging area of trying to provide some sort of experience to customers, and hopefully keep them engaged until you were able to meet again in person. Excuse me. Reservation only events, we saw a lot of those where people had to make reservations, and they were all, you know, that was done in order to control the time that you came and how many people were at the event. A lot of events now have gone to advanced sale only, and this actually is one of the really positive pieces for a lot of event organizers, because what they're finding is providing them with a lot of financial as opposed to having to wait until people arrive at the event. So it's helping with cash flow, and it's certainly helping them to kind of bankroll their event a little bit in advance. And then experiential versus static events. You know, we saw things like events where people are coming in there, you know, they're all they want to do is take pictures of themselves at the event and, you know, post it on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. And so it's really has taken a different twist where people want to actually interact in the event and be able to show their friends and you know, what a great time they're having at those events. Next slide, please. So really, we've come upon a time to, it's time to refocus and really think about how we're going to move forward. And the event planners or the event organizers who welcome and embrace change and don't fear it, I think will be the ones who will be most successful. And I think to some extent, every event planner has had to change, has had to make modifications. And I think in the event business, we're very used to changing on the fly if we have to. So we're a little bit more nimble, but we just need to continue to be flexible and nimble in order to survive into the future. Organizers are going to have to look at your, you're going to have to look at your business upside down and sideways. And perhaps things that were really important elements of your business previously, they may have become secondary and other elements may become now your focus. And so you need to really, though, look at every area and element. Your financial systems, your financial forecasting, your operational pieces, who your vendors are, where you're getting your suppliers from, how you're selling your tickets, all of those things you need to look at. And there may be opportunities for change that will benefit you, and there may be changes that you just need to make in order to continue to move forward as an event. We talked a lot about the customer. You've got to know how your customers have changed. If you don't know how your customers have changed, you really will miss the boat once you reopen. I think that anybody who thinks that they can come along and reopen the same event that they had before is probably fooling themselves. The customers have changed. The environment that we're operating has changed. Your competition's probably certainly changed. And so you need to acknowledge all of those things and think about what you need to do to tailor your event to your existing, and who are your new potential customers. Coming out of this, where are there new potential customers that perhaps will be coming to your event? We heard about, a lot of people are staying in Ontario for their vacations. What kind of opportunities does that present for you? And how can you use your event to attract those new potential customers to your event? You need to understand what your competition is. I would think that coming out of this, and we heard some statistics on this presentation, that there are probably some events that will not emerge out of the pandemic. They've just, unfortunately, they've just gone away. But there may be new events that are coming out, and there may be opportunities for event organizers to create new events. And so you really need to understand what your competition is, what other events are out there. What's your competition? Is it just other events, or is it the backyard barbecue? Or is it going to be just going to the cottage? What other things are people doing with their time now that could be perceived as competition? So let me force you to step a little bit outside of your comfort zone as you're analyzing all of those things, and it may make you consider perhaps getting rid of some of the sacred cows that you had with your event previously. I know that sometimes events can get into a rut where it's just the same thing year after year after year, right? We put the same thing in the same place with the same participants, and we attract the same people because we're having great success at it. But are there some things that you just need to get rid of and look at new ways or new elements that would really help to attract more people to your event? And your community has changed. We talked about the changes in consumer behavior. We're talking about migration of workers and the shift of people around the province and out of the province. And new people, immigration will open up again, and we're going to see immigration numbers start to escalate again. which is great for our economy because we need those people. And so how do you ensure that your event is reflective of the community that you're serving? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is a cute photo I found, a community that gathers together, stays together. And you know, our events are at the heart of our communities. They are places where community comes out and celebrates. And I think that as we come out of this pandemic and people are so looking forward to starting to do things again, they're going to gravitate back to our events, and they are going to want to come back and really celebrate the community. And our events are the hubs of our community. Next slide, please. A little bit of encouragement. In the 18 to early 1920, 21, they had the Spanish flu pandemic, which ripped through the world. And I think there were, I don't know how many millions of people died as a result of that pandemic. But, you know, the picture on the left of your screen is a woman who doesn't look very unfamiliar from what we've experienced ourselves in the last little while, working in a mask, probably isolated from her co-workers. And then this picture on the right was taken in the early 1920s, just a couple of years later, and that's a crowd at the Canadian National Exhibition. And I think that as we're starting to come out of this pandemic, we're starting to see the evolution of the re-emergence of the event and festival industry. And certainly we will see that in the coming months. And I guess the litmus test for us right now is what we're seeing in the sporting industry with things like the Raptor game and other events that will start opening up. And I think it will become very interesting over the next couple of months or weeks when we see workplaces starting to encourage people to come back to work, and, you know, activity in the city starting to become more important to people, and people will start to realize, I think, just how much they've missed getting out and celebrating with their community. And so I'm hopeful that at the end of the day, we're going to go back to seeing crowds that we saw before. You know, World War II, we had decades, we had, you know, 5 years of war, and then we went to decades of peace and prosperity with events like, you know, Expo 67 that we see on the other screen there. So next screen, please. Next screen, please. So I think there are brighter days ahead. I'm hopeful that we will return to crowds like this. This, we used to always say, was a slow day on a Tuesday afternoon at the Calgary Stampede. But, you know, people will come back out and celebrate again and interact again with each other. It's just going to take some folks a little bit longer than others. But I think that as people come back out to our events, we as event organizers have a responsibility and a duty to ensure that we put our best foot forward with our events. I think that, you know, a lot of event organizers right now are focused on, let's get this year's event up, let's get it, you know, working, let's execute it. But you really need to think about the experience that the your customer is going to have at this year's event. And it's important that they have a good event, that they have a good experience, and that they have fond memories of your event so that they will come back in future years. It would be really sad if somebody was to come out to your event and they got a diluted presentation of what perhaps you'd done in the past, and it left them with a bad taste, and it affected their desire to come back to your event in the future. I know I was talking to a friend of mine who went to a show that we both absolutely love. I didn't attend it this past year. She did, and she came back with kind of a really negative, disappointed review of what had been presented, because of course it wasn't a full show and there were a lot of elements missing that she was used to. And I said, well, there's a pandemic on, and you can't really, but she wasn't really that forgiving, and she kind of told a number of people about her experience. And so I would just say that you don't want to go out and have that type of experience for your customer. You want them to go and be good news ambassadors and talk up about your event and what a wonderful experience they had, and also to remember the experience that they had. So in the future, they will remember to come back and experience your event again and again in coming years. So that's my little presentation, Mr. Dave. I don't know if you're there.
I'm here. Thank you very much for giving
Yes.
a lot of great information that you've shared with us. Just wanted to touch on a couple things. One of the things that we also always talk about at Festivals and Events Ontario is the fact that festivals build community. And I can't help but wonder, and you touched on it in your slide, that some of the diversity issues and inclusion issues that we've seen sort of rearing their ugly head this last 2 years. And I almost wonder if it's because we haven't had the opportunity to get together and celebrate the other heritages and things that multicultural communities bring to the fabric of society. And they've not been able to share their stories, their culinary expertises, their dance and everything. And I really wonder how much negative effect that 2 years has had on people that have sort of gone down in their bunker and sort of, almost taken 10 years backward steps.
Right. And I agree with you, Dave. I think that there will be a real yearning for that type of activity again as we come out of this pandemic. I know personally myself, one of the wonderful things about living in Toronto is the diversity, and particularly, the diversity in all of the festivals and events we have, the food we have. I miss all that stuff. I haven't been out for a good Indian meal and I don't know how long, or whatever. And those events, you're right, they bring community together, and they bring people from all different backgrounds together. And we've kind of lost that sense of appreciation of who we are and what we are in that. The pandemic has really driven some wedges in. So I think that there's a real role for communities to play. And I think that that's something that presents a real opportunity, not only for the events themselves, but it presents an opportunity too when you're out talking and advocating to government. And you can talk about, these events, they're the hubs of our community, and they're going to help heal our communities as we start to recover and move forward. And not only are they going to help us recover and heal, but they're going to provide so many new opportunities. We're so concerned with youth right now because they've been at home for online learning, and they have, their sporting activities have been canceled, and their clubs and all of these other things. And now we're going to provide opportunities for them to come back out and volunteer and work and participate. And so the festival and event industry is going to be a key element in the recovery coming out of this pandemic, in my opinion.
Some other things you touched on, is your supplier base, your volunteer base. And if you haven't stayed in connection with those people, now's the time, and hopefully it's not too late. But you're right, a lot of that stuff has changed. And I think even volunteer bases that, festival and events that really rely on a huge volunteer base, are they still there, and are they still willing to come out and help?
Yeah.
And I specifically wonder about service clubs. Prior to the pandemic, we had seen a decline in service clubs and memberships. And, a lot of those service clubs are the foundation of our events that help us execute, whether it's beer gardens or food and beverage offerings or ticket sales or help with whatever. Right. And a lot of those service clubs have taken big hits, financially, where they've driven their money throughout these events throughout the years to help offset their program costs and everything. And they've had no revenue for a couple of years either.
Right. And a lot of those service clubs too, a lot of their members are older members who I think tend to be a little bit more reluctant about, re-engaging and re-emerging than perhaps younger folks are. So there will be some challenges there. And I think that and I would say this to organizers, if you have not been keeping in contact with your suppliers, you should be out doing that right now. Because I was talking to somebody who said getting a tent or getting a potlatch right now is virtually impossible because they've been using them in all these COVID areas. And fencing companies and security companies. So you need to get out and start building those relationships and having those conversations now. The other one is your volunteers and your employees. If you've had to lay your employees off or your volunteers off and you have not communicated with them during this period of time, you may be getting in for a rude surprise because, they're critical to your operation. You need to figure out a way to bring them back into the fold and make them feel like they're part of the team and embrace them. I think that the organizations that have used this period during the pandemic as a time to do professional development and educational things with their staff are the ones that are going to be successful. The ones that have kind of just ignored their staff and left them in a corner by themselves until they're ready to emerge, they may have some challenges. And the other thing too is, all of those training programs that we as event organizers have to put on, health and safety and, smart serve and, the list a mile long. But you're going to have to certify all the people. You're going to have to make all of that reinvestment, and you need time to do all of that work. So these are all things that organizers should be thinking about and planning for. As they start to move back into participating in the market again.
And that's sort of a good transition into one of next week's topic on Thursday. We've got Janet Sellery from the Event Safety Alliance with us. And, Peter Ashwin, who's been great with our risk management program here at FEO, we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago on one of the Tuesday talks, and he talked about, and I never really thought about it, but he talked about muscle memory, and it's just what we're talking about. People that have been with associations for 5 to 10 years haven't run events for 2 and 3 years, and that whole memory process of, oh yeah, when this happens, we do this. That's gone for 3 years. We don't have that. And
that's right.
You're so right about going back and checking your protocols, your health and safety, your smart serve designations, and making sure that everybody is up to date. And I know, a lot of organizations count on people's workplace to help get their volunteers that, but a lot of those have been outdated too, and people have been working out from home, and your health and safety certificates might not be up to date and renewed that we all count on. So yeah, hopefully it's not too late to get that stuff all back.
Right. And those are all things that nobody ever, really worries about or thinks about until things go south. Right. And then that's when, you're exposed. I think about the amount of time and effort that we used to spend on health and safety training of employees at the CNE. I mean, it was a full-time job for somebody to manage all of that. And it took months and months and months to do all of those, to ensure that we were meeting and exceeding those requirements set out by the regulators. So that's really, really important. And then just, the other side of it is just the general health and welfare of your employees and your volunteers. And as you say, how much of that memory is gone? How much of that corporate memory is completely lost? Those people have left your organization. I mean, never mind those people who are coming back, and it will take them some time to rethink through it. But what have you lost in corporate knowledge? What corporate knowledge has gone out the door with people shifting out of the event industry into other industries? And that's something that organizers are going to have to think about how they make up.
Virginia, Ludy, thank you very much for everything you shared today. A lot of great information that hopefully our members are going to find useful as they move forward. And if nothing else, it's certainly a great checkbox to make sure that you've done all of these steps along the way, and a lot of great points to think about. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I sit here in my office today and I'm looking out at the windows in beautiful downtown Kitchener. It's bright blue sky, a lot of building going around. And I, you know, I think of our friends in the Ukraine and all of our festivals and events that have family members there or are of Ukraine background. Our thoughts and prayers are with you. And I just can't imagine looking out the window and seeing tracer bullets and bombs falling. And, you know, our heart really goes out to everybody. And, you know, take a minute to think about those people that are fighting for their freedoms and for their lives in the Ukraine. Our thoughts and prayers from everybody here at Festivals and Events Ontario are with you all. Off the back of that, you know, I hope you can all join us next week. We've got another great week of programming lined up on Tuesday, March the 8th. Join us to hear from expert Crystal Abadasway on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The session will explore the history of DEI practices in Canada, the correlation of diversity strategy with business strategy, and provide examples of leadership inclusion practices in the modern workforce. Get the leadership and advisory skills you need to be able to build or enhance an inclusive workforce. And we're happy to say that the session is going to be hosted by Lenny Brem from ITO. Again, thank you to our staff, thank you to our volunteers, our committees for helping us make this possible. We couldn't have done this without your support. And Festivals and Events Ontario would also like to thank the following sponsors for making Energize happen: the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism and Cultural Industries, the Province of Ontario, Destination Ontario, OLG, SmartServe, and our friends at Ticket Pro. We'll see you next week, everybody.